So, yeah, and David, I'll try to set up a time with Neil so we can have that practice session with him as well.
That's good.
Yeah. Everyone, we're starting to see the registrations coming in and people joining us. Appreciate you spending St. Patrick's Day evening with us. We have several folks joining, so we're going to just wait a few minutes as registrations, since it just opened, to let everybody come in, and then we'll get started. Excellent. We got folks coming in. The number keeps creeping up. This is reassuring. Good. Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. I know a few more folks are joining, but it is 6:30 by my clock, so we will begin. Welcome again to the Great Decisions lecture series. This is the fourth in this year's series. In a moment, an SNC student, a St. Norbert student, will be introducing our speaker, but I wanted, first of all, to welcome everyone to this lecture, remind everyone that we record these lectures, and probably by Thursday, they'll be available on the St. Norbert website for viewing if someone wants to go back or if someone would like to share. A reminder that our next lecture will be on March 31st. Neil McGarvey from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow will be talking about Brexit. But if you have not already registered for that, please do so. And right now then, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, David Curry from University of Wisconsin-Green Bay.
Great, thanks, Dan. And welcome everybody to tonight's talk. I'm very excited about it. A special welcome to any students, faculty, or staff from UW-Green Bay. This is our spring break, so an extra thank you to you all for taking the time on St. Patrick's Day and during spring break to join us. So it's a very exciting topic. We're looking forward to it. We have two more, I believe, speakers left in our series, and we've been very pleased with the participation and all of the wonderful questions. So we look forward to that. If anybody has questions, please do drop them in the Q&A, and Dan and I will moderate it at the end and trying to get to as many of them as we can. So Dan, back to you.
Wonderful, thank you. And it occurred to me, I didn't introduce myself. Apologies, Daniel Stoll, Associate Dean for Global Affairs here at St. Norbert. Tonight's format is following what we've done before. Our speaker will be talking for about 25-35 minutes. We do have Q&A scheduled. As David mentioned, if you do have a question, please put it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Right now, though, I'd like to ask Devin Winkler, a St. Norbert senior biology major, to introduce our speaker and get us started. Devin?
Hello. It seems I can't activate my video. It says you have it blocked.
Oh dear. All right. Well, we're going to try to do that because we do have to see you. Sorry about that, Devin.
No worries.
You're the best looking of the four of us by far, I'm sure. So
Thank you very much.
we really want you to be with us.
There we go. And Devin, it says I, for some reason, cannot do it. So I'm afraid we're going to have your voice only. My apologies.
Okay, no worries. I'll begin then. Dr. Arthur Cyr is the director of both the A.W. Clausen Center for World Business and the International Political Economy program at Carthage. There, he is a professor of political science and an A.W. and Mary Margaret Clausen Distinguished Professor of Political Economy and World Business. He is a UCLA graduate and received his Ph.D. with distinction in political science from Harvard University. He is the author of 4 books on topics including international relations and British politics, and has written articles for many professional journals and popular press. He continues to write as he currently serves as a columnist for Gannett. He formerly served as the president of the Chicago World Trade Center and the vice president of the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations. We are very pleased to be able to hear Dr. Cyr speak tonight. So without any further ado, I will turn the floor over to him.
Thank you very much, Devin Winkler, for a very gracious introduction. You got some main points across without going on too long. I assure you I like long introductions, but I'm not sure everybody else who's with us this evening would share that sentiment equally. I certainly want to thank Dan Stoll and David Curry from St. Norbert College and the University of Wisconsin for the opportunity to be here this evening, as well as Bev Mosier, who did a good deal of the practical work of getting in touch and making sure that I showed up in the right place with the right link at the right time. Tom Clauson, whose name was mentioned, is the namesake of our Clausen Center for World Business. He's a gentleman who has a fair amount of name recognition, I learned early on. He's not as well defined as in the public mind as some other leaders. In particular, his predecessor is a very long tenured president of the World Bank, Robert Mcnamara. Mr. Mcnamara, after serving as defense secretary, a precocious president of Ford Motor Company, speaking of introductions, and then Secretary of Defense during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, is often described as the principal architect of the Vietnam War, which he was. Tom Clauson was his successor. Lyndon Johnson very graciously nominated Mr. Mcnamara for the World Bank, and Mr. Mcnamara, to his great credit, greatly increased lending to the poorest countries of the world, turned the bank into a much less conservative and cautious and much less traditional financial institution. One other quality of his leadership was he, as it turned out, did not raise the money necessary to pay for all of this activity or handle all the, as we might say, balance sheet or more business-like or more specific details of the expansion of the bank's activity. Tom Clauson came along as World Bank president during the Reagan administration, although he was nominated by Jimmy Carter. He greatly strengthened the balance sheet of the bank. In activity and work that was less dramatic than Bob McNamara's, he managed to renegotiate a tremendous number of very large loans that were being repaid at low 1950s interest rates to accommodate the much higher interest rates and rate of inflation that characterized international finance in the 70s and 80s. He also was able to get a very large number of member countries to increase their contributions to the bank. He served under Ronald Reagan, whom he knew. Reagan had been governor of California, where Bank of America was headquartered until fairly recent years. But he was actually nominated by Jimmy Carter. I got to know Tom after I'd taken the job at Carthage College. He was an unusually well-connected individual and someone who was unusually good at working across the aisle, whether it was as head of an international financial intergovernmental institution or an international corporation or otherwise. He's a Carthage College graduate who served in World War II, then went to law school, not business school. We became rather good friends after I took the job, and I'm very proud of that. He told me more than once that he felt legal training and a legal education in our system and in our country was the best kind of preparation for a business career, including a banking career, which he wanted to pursue from an early age. This isn't a lecture on Tom Clauson's career, but I'd like to mention him. He was also a Carthage College graduate before serving in the Army Air Corps in the last year of World War II in the Atlantic Theater. This isn't a commercial for Tom or Carthage College or anything else really, but to me, he personifies in many ways some of the most important aspects of globalization. He started as a teller. At least part of the audience here will know what a bank teller is. You used to have to go to a bank branch in person, and behind what was called a cage, because there were iron bars, and often the cubicle was fairly heavily reinforced because people still had a problem with bank robbery in the 1940s and 50s and into the 60s. You actually did face-to-face transactions with checks, cash, paper money, and coins. Quite alien, I know, to the undergraduate experience today for most American students and many others. He started as a teller at Bank of America and worked his way up. A very talented executive, politically talented. He wound up as president, chairman, and CEO in the early 1970s. He led the bank through a decade of very high inflation as well as high unemployment in our economy. A principal initiative of his that helped him get to the top and stay there during very difficult times was the development of international business for Bank of America. He did one of the first euro-dollar deals. As a result of the Marshall Plan, our great and very generous assistance program to recover Western Europe, the Marshall Plan was offered to East and West Europe. The communist regimes in Moscow turned it down. Western Europe, it was crucial to revival of their economy and keeping communism from spreading any further. He greatly expanded the bank's presence in Japan. Bank of America arrived in 1945, almost immediately after Japan's surrender. Before World War II, for a very small percentage of American banks, mostly large corporate banks, were involved overseas. After that war, international business became an increasingly large percentage of American banking business. Tom also had a second round as CEO of Bank of America after his 5-year tenure at the World Bank, and is credited with saving the bank, which was near bankruptcy during the savings and loan crisis in this country in the late 1980s. Much more of a domestic financial crisis, but one that had international reverberations. To me, he personifies not only a fine personal as well as professional example, but also the degree to which international business, far more than was the case before the Second World War, has been not only driving globalization, but also redefining our international economy in fundamental ways. In doing some review for the opportunity to talk with you this evening, I went through the chapter in the Great Decisions book, which is one that I've admired for many years, since my tenure at the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, now Global Affairs, back in the 1970s and 80s and through the first half of the 1990s. We promoted Great Decisions in Illinois and to some extent throughout the wider region. We're able to raise money to do so. And I particularly appreciate the opportunity to anytime at St. Norbert or anywhere else to participate in this fine program. The chapter in the Great Decisions book emphasizes from an economist's point of view the historical roots of globalization. And Krieger, another happy coincidence, Professor Krieger, who's now at the School for Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., the foreign policy and foreign service training arm of Johns Hopkins University, an emeritus professor from Duke University. She was chief economist at the World Bank, hired by Mr. Clauson, partly because she's quite skillful at the quantitative analysis of contemporary American economics, especially. But she also has a strong tendency, a strong policy interest and bent, and strong tendency to place what happens in the American context, not only in a wider international context, but in an historical context. I've also watched the video, the Cognate Great Decisions video several times on the globalization chapter. and was struck by the fact that there's certainly historical references and some nice footage of FDR, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, Winston Churchill, the very great and historic leader of Great Britain, a leader of pivotal importance in not only British, but global historical terms. Some very nice footage of their important summit meetings during World War II, President Truman during the first phases of the Cold War, and others. But it's a much more institutional and much more contemporary and much more sort of public affairs, less historically rooted presentation than in the book. And thinking about how I might try to complement and reinforce those distinctive dimensions of the examination of globalization, I thought I might mention a couple of things about American history, relatively recent, but still well removed from current events, and the personalities involved and the American attitudes involved that I think are important and also instructive in consideration of globalization. I want to talk a bit about the trends, both institutional and policy and more general, in the US and international economies that define globalization. And then I want to say a few things about the contemporary political as well as economic situation in our country and again others that bear on globalization. The video especially, Professor Krieger's chapter refers to the fact that there is a return to what might be called isolationism. I don't think that term applies to America today. It did apply historically. She refers to the fact that Donald Trump represents, among other things, in his political success in the Electoral College, and with a large sector of the American electorate, represents the fact that people are having doubts, a lot of them very strong doubts and strong hostility about our international involvements and the myriad economic, political, and human trends that sort of go under the general heading of globalization. I think that's true, but in historical terms, it's clear that we're not returning to anything like isolationism or rejecting the institutional and attitudinal facts of life that have defined our international involvements since the Second World War. There are two facts and 2 years that I want to mention, pretty far removed from contemporary concerns, especially in terms of the still early lives of our undergraduate audience and student audience here this evening. 2 years that are fairly far removed in time from contemporary concerns, but not that much. The first is 1942. The second is 1952. Both the chapter in Great Decisions and the video in Great Decisions, and a great deal of public affairs discussion in our country in recent years, right up to the present time, expresses alarm, concern, in some sectors, happiness that we are turning away from international affairs. The video very dramatically contrasts the inauguration of President Joe Biden, who emphasized America is back and we are going to be loyal to our now traditional commitments and attitudes. And Donald Trump's emphatic statement at his inauguration a little over 4 years ago, that America first, from now on, is going to be America first, America always, an important theme in his very successful, for a time, political campaign and electoral college election to the White House, was his constant iteration that we are being taken advantage of by other countries in the world. We've got to look to ourselves first of all. 1942, specifically the spring of 1942, is when American attitudes changed fundamentally. The Gallup poll organization has been around since well before World War II, one of the oldest sustained public opinion survey and analysis companies in the country, kind of lost in a much larger population of survey firms today. Their reputation was somewhat dented in 2016 when they got the presidential election wrong, like a lot of other polling organizations. But basically, they're reliable, durable, professional. and especially in earlier periods, were extremely influential and well respected. They've been taking polling going back to the early years of the Great Depression with continuous questions. One of the most important questions from my point of view and for our concerns this evening was whether or not the United States should play a more active role or a less active role in world affairs. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, destruction of the American Pacific Fleet by Imperial Japan on December 7th, 1941, 85, 90%, sometimes over 90% of the American people said essentially we should stay out of world affairs. We should not play an active and certainly not a more active role in world affairs. There was a sea change by the spring of 1942. That's not only the attack on Pearl Harbor, but Germany and Italy's declaration of war on us and our initial, and in many ways, a lot of the time, very disturbing defeats during the first months of the war, and beyond that, reverberated through the population. By the spring of 1942, rather suddenly, there was a change. Well over half, like 70 to 80% of the American people felt that we should play an active role in world affairs, and that hasn't changed. I mentioned the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, where I invested 2 decades of my working life. John Riley, the longtime president of the council, was there for 3 decades. We kept the budget balanced throughout and growing in real terms, even during the high inflation and high unemployment of the 1970s and into the 80s. One of the most distinctive and durable projects of the Chicago Council was public opinion polls taken every 4 years by the Gallup organization, for most of them, of American public opinion attitudes. It was intellectually, it was one of the most interesting things I did at the council. It was one of the most impactful of the various programs and projects that we developed during John's tenure as the chief executive officer. That continuity that first appeared in 1940, that sea change that first appeared in 1942 became continuous. In the wake of the Vietnam War, Saigon fell in the spring of 1975. Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency in the latter part of 1974. The Vietnam War, which had become very unpopular with the American people following the Tet Offensive in early 1968, clearly had an impact on foreign policy attitudes. And starting with our survey in 74, we noticed that there was something that looked like perhaps a return to isolationism. But by the late 70s, 78 and 82, opinion had bounced back. It never went anywhere near 50% or below 50% concerning an active role in world affairs. But it very quickly moved back to the high levels that have been present since 1942. Think about the significance of that. Our politics is unpredictable and highly polarized right now, although it's been polarized in one way or another through most of our history. I would argue we have a lot of social uncertainty and a certain amount of violence. We had very high crime rates and very, very sustained violence that affected the public at large from the late 1950s through the 1980s. We don't have that today, but the United States socially, historically, and currently is not only an unpredictable, but often pretty tumultuous country. We don't change our basic political attitudes in terms of our institutional commitments or how Americans collectively view the world very often. We changed in 1942, and we haven't gone back. The second year that I mentioned is 1952, and that has a lot more to do with personalities and leadership and a lot less to do with basic socio-political trends, but I would argue is equally important. Dwight Eisenhower was nominated for president by the Republican Party in 1952. Richard Nixon, his running mate, was a freshman senator from California. Globalization and isolationism, the basic conflicts in American history, right down to the present, in our economics and our institutional involvements, as well as our politics and economics. That, in effect, was decisively defeated in ways that continue to resonate politically in 1952. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander in World War II in the Atlantic Theater and in Europe, a crucial figure in terms of victory in that war, was actually behind. Eisenhower, the great magician, had a way of making what had been accomplished look easy or at some level perhaps automatic, whether it was winning World War II or getting the Republican nomination in 52 and going on to a landslide victory. That's one dimension of his, to me, very fascinating leadership qualities and brilliance as an Allied military commander or as a politician who became enormously successful, who reached the White House on his first try without an electoral politics career, not a conventional American election political career leading up to that triumph. He was actually behind Senator Robert Taft, Mr. Republican, the scion of a great Ohio-based Republican family, indeed dynasty, that included one president and Supreme Court justice, several senators and governors of Ohio. He was the front runner in 1952. It was the last openly contested American political convention in American political life, although Ronald Reagan came very close to breaking open the 1976 Republican convention when he challenged an incumbent, though not elected President Gerald Ford. Eisenhower and his principal campaign manager and advisor, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, and the other mostly Northeastern liberal and internationalist Republicans who were behind his candidacy, worked extremely hard, almost all of it behind the scenes, to cut into, to weaken, and then overcome what had been a lead in delegates behind Robert Taft when the convention opened. Taft, like Eisenhower, was certainly an admirable man, an admirable person in terms of personal character, but his political views were almost completely the opposite of Ike's. He was a committed isolationist. He had basically opposed, although he compromised his views to some extent publicly. He was opposed to the United Nations. He was opposed to the NATO alliance. He was opposed to much of the New Deal reforms that had become established in American life, including Social Security, by the early 1950s. Had Taft gotten the nomination, America's commitment to internationalism would have been compromised and might well have been reversed. In desperation, as the convention battle went on and Taft realized he was actually losing after arriving in Chicago as the winner, in desperation, he went to General Douglas MacArthur, an equally visible but very different personality and political type than Ike, and offered MacArthur, who had very strong but limited right-wing support in the United States, the vice presidential nomination. 52 was a Republican year, and had Taft been nominated, I'm pretty confident that he had at least a good chance of winning. Taft died during Eisenhower's first term. We came very close to having President Douglas MacArthur rather than President Dwight Eisenhower, something we can discuss more in the question period if you wish. Eisenhower, over 2 terms, not only established very, very strong practical collaboration with congressional leaders, and the Democrats controlled Congress for 6 of Ike's 8 years in office. Sam Rayburn, the longest Speaker of the House before Nancy Pelosi surpassed that record, was in charge of the Democratic majority in the House. It was a much more nonpartisan office in those days, in many ways more powerful. Lyndon Johnson was the very domineering and dominant majority leader of the Senate. Partisan hostility, partisan acrimony was part of American political life then as now. But Eisenhower was able to mute and greatly reduce that in the Congress. He was able to isolate and over time weaken the powerful and in some ways dominant isolationist wing of the Republican Party. We were committed to internationalism at the end of Ike's 8 years in office in a way that had not been the case before and would not have been the case, in my opinion at least, had Robert Taft been elected or had Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee, been able to secure the White House then. Richard Nixon effectively forced his way on the ticket. Eisenhower wasn't opposed to him. He was not Ike's choice. He ideally positioned himself as the one prominent Republican, albeit a younger, much younger leader than the establishment, through being tied both to the right wing of the party, a close associate of Joseph McCarthy, and a participant in the anti-communist sentiment, anti-communist hysteria that animated the country in the late 1940s and well into the 1950s. But he was also a committed internationalist and a strong supporter of the Marshall Plan, the NATO alliance. He uniquely positioned himself, which is how he became, at 39 years of age, the second youngest vice president in the history of the United States. Both the video and the chapter spend a lot of time, quite rightly, on the institutions that define globalization. The chapter in Great Decisions, Professor Krieger does a good job of presenting several hundred years of globalization history, if you will, in capsule form. I draw your attention in particular to her very knowledgeable, very comfortable references to great human migrations, including from Africa into Europe historically. One dimension of globalization that is much in the news today. I'd also draw your attention to her references to the Industrial Revolution, which began in England and Scotland at the end of the 1600s with the invention of the steam engine, not the steam locomotive. And again, her very knowledgeable and comfortable references to the panoply of technological innovations that define globalization today. She doesn't refer that much to the institutional superstructure of globalization. That's an area that I think is particularly important to emphasize in terms of understanding how things have changed while important ways remaining the same. Near the end of World War II, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the Allies, the Soviets did not participate, but the British and American allies and token representatives from others met in a hotel in New England, the name Bretton Woods, and hammered out the economic institutions that were confirmed along with the rest of the United Nations, in great contrast to the failure of the League of Nations in the interwar period, and have remained not only remarkably durable, but I would argue have gotten steadily stronger over time, especially since the end of the Cold War and collapse of the old Soviet Union in 1991, during the period 89, 90, and 91. But from 91, we really had global acceptance, with the exception of only a couple of peripheral countries, of the economic arms of the United Nations. The International Monetary Fund, which has facilitated basic stability in currency exchange rates, in currency supplies, and especially after the fixed exchange rates, $35 to an ounce of gold, and all other currencies, at least major currencies outside of the communist bloc, fixed essentially to the value of the US dollar. After Nixon quite rightly ended fixed exchange rates, basically recognized a very different economic reality from the post-war period. In August of 1971, the International Monetary Fund has done an impressive, generally not very visible job of facilitating international liquidity and helping to facilitate basic stability of currencies, avoiding the kind of competitive devaluations that characterized industrial countries in the 20s and 30s and facilitated the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany to national power, as well as other kinds of instabilities around the world. The general agreement on tariffs and trade, again, designed to maintain stability internationally by keeping tariff barriers and competitive expansion of tariff and non-tariff barriers from rising, at least rapidly and excessively. An international trade organization that was part of the Bretton Woods Agreement was never confirmed by the US Congress and language. By 1948, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was in place, succeeded in the 1990s by the World Trade Organization, reflecting a very different world, a world in which tariffs were not the most serious trade barriers anymore, more subtle ways for nations to restrict their trade activities with other countries to become much more prominent. With the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the imposition of reality on literally everyone around the world, including the communist regime in China, the World Trade Organization and the IMF and the World Bank, the third large principal economic arm of the United Nations, they became truly global organizations for the first time. During the Cold War, starting with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union, even before the end of World War II, those economic institutions were rightly seen as dangerous to the established communist structure, and they were rejected. Institutionally, we have today a truly global system which facilitates globalization. Most important to keep in mind, especially given the rather cartoon analysis of Donald Trump's political rise and continues to characterize commentary about him since he departed the White House, thankfully departed from my partisan point of view, is that he was somehow the 800-pound gorilla or the King Kong force that was tearing down these global institutions. He did withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords. The Democrats have returned with the Biden administration. He did withdraw from the six-power agreement limiting nuclear development in Iran and the danger of nuclear weapons, at least over a relatively short term in Iran. The Biden administration has returned. He started to withdraw from the World Health Organization and one or two other fairly specific UN committees and commissions. But he didn't reject, outside of rhetoric, he didn't withdraw the United States from the NATO alliance. He didn't withdraw in any practical sense, as opposed to rhetoric, from the UN. That represents to me, again, confirmation of the fact that our commitment to international organizations and the process of globalization is continuous. It's a much different atmosphere from that which characterized the US historically, after World War II, in important ways through the 1960s and into the 1970s, something we could discuss more during the question period, if you will. Finally, in terms of contemporary international affairs, the growth of private military corporations is, to me, the most important contemporary manifestation of the continuing importance of nationalism, related to the fact that overwhelmingly organized military force is controlled by the nation state, not by international organizations. It's not part of the globalization debate, but I believe strongly that it should be. I apologize for going a little over time, and I hope this has been clear as well as interesting, at least to most of the people who are with us this evening. Thank you.
Art, thank you so much. A wonderful overview and introduction to the topic. I know we've got a number of questions coming in, so I wanted to leave plenty of time to start with some of those. A couple of questions related to the issue more contemporary of competition within the global system, and also the role that, say, China plays as a competitor to the United States, and it plays out within a globalization context, becoming a dominant economic power, for example, militarily. How would you assess the role of China as a competitor within the international system today?
I think we tend to demonize the sort of main competitor of the week, the year, the decade. I think it's not surprising, it's understandable that China is currently the bête noire, the enemy du jour. I'm a professor on the sidelines. I don't have public policy responsibility or business responsibility. So I can speak comfortably in a way that other people can't who are in the front line of our foreign policy or business activity. China does engage very insidiously and ruthlessly in commercial, industrial, technological, and governmental espionage, as do the Russians. It's always a question, especially regarding Russia, how much of this is directed from the top and how much is it the activity of freelancers and wannabes. I think it's sensible to assume that any serious violations, not just our law, but international agreements, is directed from the top. Even discounting from that, I don't think China represents a serious threat to the United States. Our economies are complementary, in contrast to the US and the US and Japan, which had a much more direct across-the-board competition from equally ruthless from the 1970s well into the 1990s. Who talks about Japan today as a principal foe of the United States? Our students are so audio-visual, which is fine. I try to take advantage of that by showing a lot of video and film in class along with PowerPoints. I get even by showing old film and old video. Executive Suite, Academy Award winner of the mid-50s. I commend to you for anybody who wants to learn about human relations then or now, as well as economics and business. I show the students the first Kennedy-Nixon debate from 1960. China isn't mentioned, except fleetingly. Japan isn't mentioned. The Soviet Union is mentioned and emphasized by Jack Kennedy as the principal threat to the United States.
Thanks. David, I think you've got a couple of more questions as well.
Yeah, so we have a question here that someone noted that after World War II, the United States really became the world police in many ways, a phrase that we quite often hear and has been doing so for a long time now. And he asks whether the US is in the same position that the UK was right before World War II started, somewhat of a waning power. I mean, I guess perhaps your thoughts or comments about that, but also a question related to globalization that President Trump also brought up and others before him. Should the United States continue to be the world's police? Is this a role for world security that the United States should continue to play and can be able to play?
That's a very good question, and I'll try to be more focused and brief in my answers. The British, for a couple of hundred years, from the late 1600s, early 1700s into the 1900s, pretty much ran the world. In hindsight, I think they did a good job, more or less, considering the time and considering the values of much earlier generations of people. They emphasized international agreements. They emphasized negotiation, especially as an alternative to war. The United States is not the world's policeman. We've occasionally tried to be, or police person. We've occasionally tried to be. Important to me, perhaps the most important lesson to me, is we've done extremely well when we've done it under the rubric of the United Nations, the NATO alliance, and reliable and impressive allies. The Korean War is one example. The first Gulf War or the Persian Gulf War is another example. Our intervention, which was inevitable in Afghanistan, is another example. When we tried to go it alone, whether it's in Vietnam over a very long period of time or in Iraq in 2003, a terrible blunder, perhaps the worst blunder, in my opinion, of US foreign policy since the war, we haven't done so well. The lesson is do your best to work with alliances. And if you decide to use force, do what the British have done historically, what we did not do in Vietnam, until very late in the day. I'm very mindful, I assure you, just how rigid and ruthless the revolutionaries were in Vietnam. Nonetheless, there's an American love affair with firepower that the British have avoided. And they're much more likely than us to not only emphasize alliances historically, but also the combination, the mutual importance, the importance of integrating negotiation and diplomacy on the one hand with whatever you decide to do militarily on the other. The one colonial power, as far as I know, that avoided long-term quagmires after World War II as nationalism rose in the Third World. They had more colonial involvements than any other country, but I'm not aware that they had came to the kind of grief that the French and we did in Indochina, the Dutch in Indonesia, the French in Algeria.
Art, a question about the impact that COVID has had on globalization, particularly the impact on travel as well as international business. Wondering if you could maybe unpack that a bit.
Yes, indeed. I think it shows the importance. Annie Krieger rightly emphasizes technology in a very knowledgeable way. It shows the importance of technology for both good and ill. I thought we would have an economic collapse after we shut down in the spring of last year. And it's one reason I'm a professor rather than running a hedge fund or a finance institution, even if I were so inclined. We've done remarkably well, partly because of very good public policy, in my opinion, but also automation and not only remote working, but automated, if you will, buying and selling. The fact that we don't need old-fashioned in-person or mostly in-person transactions has been crucial in maintaining commercial activity within the economy and industrial activity. Basic construction jobs, basic physical labor jobs haven't changed that much in the current period. I think technology and globalization in terms of rapid communication of disease is the downside of globalization. But I think rapid, and if you're talking about any big pharmaceutical company, not just American, international collaboration and product development has really been crucial in explaining in the success of developing a vaccine very quickly. Globalization is why we've been able to do so much to address this public health problem directly. Age has its disadvantages. It also has some advantages. In particular perspective, I'm old enough to have been around during the Hong Kong flu in 1968-69, which the media almost entirely ignores. Several 100,000, mostly young men rotating back from Vietnam, spread this serious disease like wildfire. President Lyndon Johnson was in the hospital for 2 weeks, including some time in intensive care. Over 100,000 Americans died. I believe far more died. We didn't measure deaths that we could associate with the disease as rigorously or as pervasively or as kind of obsessively as we are currently. I recall military police, first responders, public health workers, law enforcement, people in hospitals were wearing masks. But otherwise, you couldn't work remotely. We didn't have the computer revolution until the 1970s. A public health problem was something that you just worked your way through. The fact that we can do so much and our expectations are so high and we're so secure, I think, is basically a function of globalization. We also seem to be much more easily alarmed. You may think this is just an irritable old man talking, and it could be, but a public health problem was something that was part of life, including polio, which was this horrific scourge affecting mostly infants and young children. That's been gone since the mid-50s. So our expectations are a lot higher. And keeping that in mind, I think, can help assuage the fear that we've all seen. Among people of all ages, I find it both disheartening and inspiring, therefore. But both the plus and the minus characteristics of COVID-19, I think, are a direct function of globalization and the way we live today. It took a while for the Hong Kong flu to spread. And by the time we woke up to it, it had already spread widely. COVID-19, insidious. I've talked to knowledgeable scientists and MDs who feel it spread a lot in this country before the alarm was raised. But we nonetheless reacted much more quickly once the problem was recognized.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
David.
Yeah, another question that came up has to do with climate change. And I think that this is one of the classic examples of how globalization and global cooperation is really important. But the counter argument is, the economy. And, what do you tell states like West Virginia or Texas, Oklahoma that rely so much on coal, or now North Dakota fracking and the gas industry? What are your thoughts about the ability of the US to perhaps lead in climate change, or how globalization has affected that?
I think it's undeniable that the US has been a leader, given our not only scientific leadership in the world, but our public policy leadership, even during the Trump administration. It's a source of kind of erratic change in policy depending on which party's in the White House. To me, the most important point, to give you a straight answer, is the gigantic growth of green industry. From time to time, the Wall Street Journal will have a special section on corporate investment in environmentally friendly products and practices of all kinds. John Kerry, as many in our audience will know, has been appointed as special climate, I don't like the term czar. He's been given a special role in coordinating federal climate policy with cabinet standing. The Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, thanks to Ditchley Park, a conference center in Oxfordshire, they realized in the 80s that they couldn't rely on the old Northeastern establishment in the future, and they came to Reg Hibbert, the executive director, a very distinguished diplomat, came to Chicago as well as Atlanta and LA. And we worked out an alliance with them that endured, and they've been nice enough to keep me on their invitation list. John Kerry was their annual lecture speaker. I can't remember the exact year, not too long ago. I think after his 2004 presidential campaign. Their annual lectures are on their website. He had a huge amount of specific, very detailed information on the enormous amount of corporate investment in this country, billions of dollars that's going into environmentally friendly manufacturing, production, other business practices. A good symbol and metaphor, I think, is the tremendous amount of investment and fascinating kind of wild activity going into electric vehicles of all kinds, including by GM, as well as the indomitable head of Tesla. So I'm optimistic about government business cooperation in this area.
Art, we've had a couple of questions come in related to globalization and its impact on Central and South America.
Yes.
In particular, would you envision some sort of, for example, Marshall Plan for Central America that would lead to increased development there, possibly have that affect the flow of populations up into the United States?
Yes, I don't anticipate a Marshall Plan in Central or South America. I certainly hope not. We're not dealing with a relatively advanced industrial area that's been totally flattened and devastated by total war, as we did in Europe right after the Second World War. I don't think we need Uncle Sam trying to change Latin America in the future, as we've often tried to do in the past, often with disastrous consequences. Probably the worst period in our history with 2020 hindsight since the Second World War was during the Kennedy administration, when an obsession with killing Fidel Castro as well as overthrowing his regime led to all kinds of negative consequences for this country, in my opinion. During that period, except for Costa Rica, and occasionally one or two South American nations which would experiment with democracy, there was no functioning democracy in Latin America throughout the region. I don't think I'm exaggerating. The current period, Cuba is all that's left. Even Venezuela has to have elections. So I don't think the political support is there for a Marshall Plan, but I would very much urge that Americans not get carried away by good intentions and try to launch a Marshall Plan for Latin America or anywhere else in the world.
Great, thank you. We also had a question, sort of very pragmatic and general, that what are some of the direct effects or the importance of globalization for an average American? Why should somebody care about this?
For one thing, it's very disruptive in our economy, and it's also blamed for all kinds of disruptions that would happen anyway. The proportion of the American population on farms is now under 2%. It may be 1% at this point. We continue to be the largest agricultural exporter as well as importer in the world. We're the biggest and most efficient producer by far. In 1900, about 50% of the population lived and worked on farms. Something similar is going on in manufacturing. And in another 10 or 20 years, it'll be a very small percentage of the American population. I believe that would happen whether we had, we would be a lot less wealthy and a lot less well off if we raised trade barriers more than we have in place today. I don't think it's primarily a function of jobs being taken from the assembly line in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or Green Bay and moved to Mexico or moved to China. Nonetheless, it is a disruptive process, and a lot of working people have been put out of work. Their lives have been turned upside down. People who are less likely to be in an audience like this, people who are in effect on the front lines of the disruption of the modern economy. I don't think it's because of globalization per se, but I do think it's extremely important that this be addressed. Donald Trump represented and represents a very important phenomenon. I don't think he has the answer, but he represents American voices who must and will be heard in our political process. So globalization is disruptive, but I think the disruption would occur even if we were much more protectionist than we are today.
Art, I think we've got time for one more question, and it's going to go back to a theme that you picked up on earlier, you know, the global financial markets and the infrastructure. So wanting to know the impact that you see globalization on banking and investment, and where does that place the United States?
Banking and investment, yes, we will remain, I think, the principal financial center in the world indefinitely. Again, this is a professor talking, and we tend to be much better at predicting the past than, in particular, the immediate short-term business future. However, we are an unprecedented and unequaled magnet for investment. Earlier in my life, especially in the 60s and 70s, we heard constant warnings about the American balance of payments and balance of trade and then balance of payments deficits. Conventional economics dictates that will lead you to a lower standard of living over time. That hasn't happened to us. Our deficits are even greater in absolute terms than they were when we were concerned about it. It's because we are a gigantic and unprecedented magnet for investment. My guess is that London is not going to disappear as a principal, in many ways, the #1 financial capital in the world. I think they will be still in areas like insurance. Stock market activity is already going on to the continent, but Brexit, I think, will probably make our role even stronger in terms of international finance. Finally, banking is a principal measure of globalization. We all know about the internet and use it, a function of the Pentagon, specifically DARPA, the Advanced Projects Agency in the Defense Department. It started out as a military communications network worldwide. A precursor in practical terms is an electronic network facilitated by satellite communications. In 1973, banking became global because banks for the first time could literally send money around the world electronically. You didn't need a courier with a letter of credit and proper identification. You didn't need to use any kind of postal mail or special courier mail at all. Banking and finance from 73 especially has been not only a symbol of, but a driver of globalization. Annie Krieger mentions the telegraph as well as the telephone in her book chapter, and I think that is another comparable example of the communications dimension of globalization that's so crucial.
Good. Art, thank you very much. We really appreciate this discussion, this analysis of globalization. Unfortunately, yet again, we have not gotten to all the questions, but we will perhaps save those for another time when we can bring you back.
I'll be glad to, if people want to send me an email, excuse me, send it to acyr@carthage.edu. And I'll be alert, especially to anyone who mentions great decisions at St. Norbert College.
Good.
No, but I really look forward, I really appreciate this kind of thing. It's a tonic, especially at my age, and I really appreciate the community and student involvement.
Thank you. Everyone, thanks again for joining us this evening. As a reminder, the March 31st lecture will be on Brexit. Neil McGarvey from University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And until then, thank you for joining, and we will see you in a couple of weeks. Good night.
Good night, everyone.